Science is all around us. It shapes everything we do every day, whether we know it or not. In 2022, the HSRC conducted a first of its kind survey on the public relationship with science. The true value of science only comes when people and society engages with it. Today we are connecting data with dialogue, science with society, and you to social science that makes a difference. I'm Nicole van Reede, and this is HSRC Connect. On today's Connect, we are talking about science engagement and how the public has a relationship with science. We are filming at the Iziko Museum, who has been a pillar of science engagement for the last 200 years. On that note, I'd like to introduce the panel to you today. We have Dr. Michael Gastro, who is the Director of Science and Society at the HSRC, with a special interest and expertise in STI policy, digital technologies, and AI in the context of social science. Welcome, Michael.
Hi, Nicole. Thank you for having me here at this wonderful museum. Looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you. Then we have Dr. Sahir Parker. He is a Senior Research Manager at the Center for Science and Society. He has expertise in a number of years of R&D measurement, the impact of science, technology, and innovation on society, but also the nexus or intersection between science, society, and policy. Welcome, Saeed.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you for having us.
Nice to have you here. Then we have Dr. Lorenza Flux. She is a senior research specialist with expertise in community engagement, participatory research methods, gender, and intersectional approaches. Welcome, Lorenza.
Thanks, Nicole. Happy to be here.
And then from Iziko Museum itself, we have the wonderful Miss Shanae van Niekerk. She is an engagement officer here at the museum. So if you visit the museum, you might meet her. And she has a very interesting background. She has a background academically in environmental sciences, but she also has a background in teaching and passionate about making science real and tangible to people and society. Welcome, Shanae.
Thank you, Nicole, and welcome to my office.
Lovely to be here. And then online, we have some more panelists. We have Sylvia Hanan, who is a chief researcher at the HSRC. She has a special interest in engagement, or science engagement, science communication, the promotion of science, the public awareness of science, and really looking at STEM pathways for the youth. Also joining us online, we have Dr. Ben Roberts, who is a research director at the HSRC, and he has been actively involved in the South African Social Attitudes Survey, as well as the survey that we are talking about today, which is the South African Public Relationship with Science. And he also has a very special interest in research infrastructure. And then lastly, joining us today is Mr. Isaac Ramova, and he's from the Department of Science, Technology, and Innovation, and he will give us some insight into the role of policy and government when it comes to science communication and engagement. So before we get into the panel in the room, I think it's very important for us to get some understanding of the survey and what it means. So I'd like to ask you, Sylvia, who is joining us online, if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about the South African Public Relationship with Science survey.
So the South African Public Relationship with Science survey was institutionalized through the 2019 White Paper on Science, Technology and Innovation. And this found that there were significant gaps in the public's knowledge and understanding of science, and they wanted to find a way for monitoring and evaluation of these elements, to look at them as a baseline. So the survey was conducted first in 2022 to provide baseline measures, and it will be conducted every 5 years to provide trend measures so that we can see if we are moving in the right direction in terms of South Africans' knowledge, understanding, perceptions, attitudes, and engagement with science and technology. So the survey was funded by the Department of Science, Technology and Innovation, and this was led by Isaac Ramova in the Science Promotion Unit, and in conjunction with being led by Dr. Vijay Reddy at the HSRC. And it's the first nationally representative, fully dedicated survey on the public relationship with science in South Africa.
And then Ben, I know that you were a big part of conducting the survey, and it was fairly large. How did you manage the survey? Maybe you can give us some insight into managing such a large-scale survey.
Yeah, it's quite a big undertaking. A sample of 6,400 for the Public Relationship with Science survey it means that you're trying to cover wide range of geographies, those from big metropolitan areas with issues of gated access, through to quite remote rural areas that take significant amount of travel time. So it's about planning effectively the kind of deployment of a big field team, and it's around about 150 field staff. They have to be very well prepared with the understanding not only of the questions included in the PRS, but also thinking through how they get deployed, the negotiated entry protocols. So it's a huge undertaking. I think those that work with our users of survey data often don't appreciate the huge labor, and it's a labor of love, that goes into the generation of data, and the sheer complexities of having large teams of interviewers across a range of provinces go out there often in inclement weather conditions to deal and go physically to the places we've randomly sampled. So it's a massive undertaking, needs careful planning and strong coordination. But ultimately it's about the skills and the perseverance and the commitment of a very dedicated team of data collectors who go out there and strive to produce high quality data that is truly representative of our public across all provinces in our country.
And then back to you, Sylvia. Why do you think it is important for South Africans to have an understanding of science and technology?
So science and technology are all around us in our everyday lived experiences, from the stoves that we cook on every day, the fridges that we use to cool our food, our cell phones, which are part of our use every day. I mean, I think a lot of people spend a lot of time on their phones, our computers, even our cars, buses, other transport we might use. All of these are based on principles of science and use technology to function. And as we know, AI is affecting the way the world is changing. So as we become more and more digital, we need to make sure that everyone has some understanding of science and technology and has opportunities to participate in these areas. So we know that science and technology are part of our everyday lives. They affect and are part of our employment, part of our economic and social development, as well as our education and health. And also aspects such as climate change are related to science. Science and technology really are a core value proposition in our lives that we need to all have some understanding of. And we know that not everyone is interested in science and technology. Not everyone is going to pursue a degree in STEM areas. And we know that not everyone is going to want to work in these areas. But we do feel it's important for everyone to have some basic scientific literacy and an understanding of these concepts so that they can engage in scientific discussions, have a basic understanding of what is going on around them in terms of science and technology and the developments that are being made, and also be able to leverage their knowledge of science and technology to help improve their communities or better their own lives. So together with our partners at the DSTI, we're hoping to shift the culture of science in South Africa so that it is more inclusive and equitable.
And I think this is a very important part where we need to understand what the public or government perspective is from the Department of Science, Technology and Innovation. Why do you think, in your opinion, is science engagement critical for South Africans?
The intention here is to build a society that is science aware and science literate. The kind of society that can independently express own opinion on science issues. And we believe that achieving that kind of society help us to achieve inclusive participation in science issues, which we consider necessary for building a thriving national system of innovation. We need that kind of a national system of innovation to drive our economic growth.
Sylvia, I'd like to come back to you, and maybe you can just highlight some of the key findings of the survey.
So the survey showed us that South Africans are knowledgeable about science and technology, particularly areas that impact their everyday lived experiences. So for example, they were more knowledgeable about areas related to food security, the provision of water, education and energy supply. This was found in the quiz that was asked to the respondents, where they were asked various items related to science and technology, and they had to say whether they were true or false. And we found that 60% of adults demonstrated a promising level of scientific knowledge. So that was the average percentage of correct responses to the set of items. And we found that the items that they were most knowledgeable about were the ones that related to their everyday lives. So for example, a question about the COVID-19 vaccine during the pandemic, as well as whether the price of petrol is related to the price of world oil. So it's again elements that are relevant to their everyday experiences. South Africans also recognized both the benefits and the risks of science and technology. So these are referred to as the promise and reservation attitudes that South Africans have. And we found that South Africans both recognize that science and technology have great benefits, but they also acknowledge and recognize the risks that they pose. So for example, they also agreed that new technologies are going to take jobs away from people, but overall they seemed to agree that the benefits of science and technology are greater than the harm. So it's good that South Africans are able to recognize both the pros and cons of science and technology and have a balanced view of the benefits that they promise as well as the risks that they pose. We also found that around 70% of the South African public had a high level of trust in the work of scientists, as well as the scientific information received from universities and research organizations. And this is something that we can leverage to harness and increase the level of trust that South Africans do have, and make sure that we are using the right platforms to reach South Africans about science and technology. We also found South Africans are interested in science and technology information, with 66% expressing a general interest in science and technology. But we also found that the active accessing, so searching for science and technology information, was fairly low. The most common and most trusted sources of science and technology information remain television and radio, which is what has been found in previous smaller scale studies that have been done. But we also anticipate that this will change as online and mobile sources of information are becoming more popular. South Africans also reported a relatively low level of engagement with science. So we looked at 5 science engagement behaviors, which included exposure to STEM subjects at school after grade 9. The second one was attraction-based attendance. So this was attendance at science spaces or science activities like museums, science and technology centers, and science events at public libraries. The third one that we looked at was community-based engagement. So this was involvement in events or activities that directly benefit communities, for example, recycling and reducing plastic usage, as well as taking part in river cleanups and those kind of events. We also looked at the use of online apps, which we know is more heavily resource dependent, as well as sharing of science and technology information, and what channels South Africans use to share this information, and this was also quite low. For many of these activities, they are dependent quite heavily on access and resources. So this is something that needs to be considered. What we did find is that many of these measures that we looked at were related to socio-demographic characteristics, which highlight the inequalities across South Africa. So many of these were dependent on aspects such as socioeconomic status, education, as well as geographic location. And what we find is that marginalised groups have experienced greater barriers to science and technology, information access, engagement, and all of those measures, as they have limited access and opportunities to engage with science and technology. So we find almost a dual population where some people have greater access and opportunities while others do not, and this creates greater inequalities in engaging with science and technology. Okay. So what we found is that in general, younger, better educated individuals with higher socioeconomic status backgrounds, those who are employed, those that had higher home education support, as well as those living in urban areas, were more likely to have a positive relationship with science. So in terms of generally higher levels of knowledge, greater trust, more interest, and greater engagement because they are able to access these opportunities more easily. So the data shows us that there are different outcomes for these different groups in South Africa. And what we want to do is shift science culture in the country in the future to make sure that opportunities are accessible to all segments of society and to ensure that we have a more equal level of access and engagement with science and technology, irrespective of socioeconomic circumstances. So what we really want is a culture in South Africa where science and technology is for everyone.
And then maybe for you, Isaac Remova, if you could maybe give us some insight into some of the findings that were most interesting and critical for you.
The fact that South Africans could freely identify priority research areas, in my view, it's an indication that they are able to set the research agenda.
Okay, let's get into the discussion with our in-studio guests. So the first thing, I think, Sahir, you have a very interesting background. You have experience in conducting R&D surveys, but you also have experience both in practice and theory around science communication and science engagement. So I'd like to ask you, how do you think this data relates to science engagement, and maybe highlight some of the key findings, what findings you think were key for you?
Thank you, Nicole. I think the South African public relationship with science survey really becomes the oxygen that breathes life into South African science policy, especially policies like the white paper, policies like the science engagement strategy that aims to connect in a more meaningful way the sciences to the lives and lived realities of very many South Africans. The data itself highlights, as Sylvia pointed out earlier, issues related to knowledge, public attitudes to science, awareness of scientific activities, trust, pride and promise, which is something South Africans are never in short supply of, but also science engagement behaviors. And that's quite important as we sit here under the roof of this enormous institution of science in South Africa, 200 years old this year. And we understand that South Africans have a very different relationship with science. We've got a unique fingerprint. Our data tells us that from the 2022 SAPRS survey. But that being said, the locations of science engagement, the opportunities for science engagement are somewhat affected by the history of South Africa, and we must take that into account. So the SAPRS data tells us who has access, who struggles to get access, which communities we need to pay more attention to, and where we can take our sciences out of these amazing facilities and into our communities. What we have to do is to leverage the trust that we have in some of our institutions, museums, science councils, science clubs, within the local context, is able to, what you could say, translate practical science into accessible terminology and in ways that will allow communities to see the value in their everyday lives.
Thank you. And I think that concepts such as science, data, accessibility, it can be very abstract concepts. So I'd like to come to you, Lorenzo. I'd like you to reflect and try to ground these very abstract concepts in lived realities. So as a woman in science, I'd like you to reflect, was there anything in your experience where you lived inaccessibility to science?
Thanks, Nicole. So let me start by saying that I didn't grow up surrounded by lab coats and telescopes. I grew up as a colored girl in a colored community. I went to primary and high school schools that are quintile 1, where they are low fees or no fee schools, right? But I did have my mother, and she was a teacher. And so in our household, it was always like we were always surrounded by books. Homework was important, your studies was important. So that really laid a strong foundation for me. But so I would also say that despite that strong foundation and the support that I had from my mother, I still didn't want to choose physical sciences in grade 10 to 12 because the subject had a reputation for breaking people and our matric learners were failing, and I decided I don't want to walk that path. But looking back, I mean, at 15 and 16 years old, you are not really equipped to make those kinds of decisions that can actually close down doors for you somewhere along the line on, you know, a path that you haven't even tried to walk in. So there's a lot to say on that point, but I don't feel that I'm equipped to speak on the education system. But I want to reflect on something that stood out from the survey, which is the incredible importance of educational support at home. So as an adult now, I realize the importance of, you know, that early engagement and fostering curiosity at an early age. And this is what I try to give to my children now. And so my son, he's almost 8. He's into stars and space. He knows a lot about black holes. And he does experibuddies at school, and he does robotics. And my daughter is 4, and she's really into early maths now at a very young age of 4. And I mean, they do experiments at home. At any given moment, they can ask for baking soda, for vinegar, because they want to do an experiment. And I realized that while I'm so happy to support them and fostering that curiosity, I know that there are many households who cannot offer this. And even in households, girls often have a bigger caregiving burden or chores compared to boys. Women carry much of the brunt of, caregiving at home compared to men. So our roles are something that really brings divide between boys and girls, men and women, and their access to science and their opportunities to thrive in science. So this is also where our science engagement need to bridge those divides that Sahir mentioned around income, around location, and who gets to do science, who even gets to dream about becoming a scientist. So our approaches to reaching those kind of people also need to cover those divides so that a child's opportunities are never limited by where they grow up or by their parents' abilities to have, an endless supply of vinegar and baking soda. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And on that point, I actually want to go to Shanae, because you are perfectly positioned at the interface of science engagement, and I'm sure you get to engage with diverse groups of people and children. How do you define science engagement, or what does it mean to you in your role?
Thank you. It's quite a difficult topic to pinpoint, as every outreach officer will tell you. We all gauge our success on outreach as very difficult or different quantities. Personally, I do feel you had successful engagement when people feel comfortable and confident within walking away. So if they walk away, they feel inspired, you can see that they feel more confident in asking the correct questions, be it any question is the correct question. You also see that people understand topics that perhaps was not accessible previously to them. We also need to understand that, as Lorraine said, it's a broad spectrum of diverse backgrounds that we are dealing with. We need to keep engagement accessible and a constant steady stream of accessible. As soon as we cut off that accessibility, we start to see kids not choosing going into STEAM. And it's unfortunate. We want to create curiosity within the environment, and I think it's successful when the curiosity blossoms into moving into science. But I want to emphasize, when we see curiosity in children at any age, even adults, we want to keep that stream alive. I want to aid and embed that curiosity to have them flow a conversation with those around and outside their group of people. Once we see that curiosity blossom into conversations, we know it's been successful. We see that engagement across all broad spectrums, and I think that's important. It's important to keep the conversation going.
I couldn't agree more with you. So Michael, I actually want to come to you, because we've spoken about context and we've spoken about diversity of people, of countries, of everything. But as diverse as our context is, and ever-changing, so is science, right? And the most interesting thing about the survey is it was conducted pre-AI, right? So how do you think now, with the upcoming survey and the immense influence and impact that AI has had on science or just researchers and our daily lives, what do you think would be the most interesting change or challenge that you foresee in the next round of the survey?
Yeah, thank you, Nicole, for that. I think it's a relevant question for this discussion. And the short answer is that we don't know how perceptions will change. Partly because we don't know how AI itself will change, and we don't fully understand the impact that AI will have on perceptions. But we can conceive of some trends that we can potentially expect. Some of these trends we'll be able to measure. After 2023, there was an interest in measuring public perceptions of AI. Some large surveys went to field. We'll get the results back next year, so we'll be able to confirm some of these expectations. But the first one is an increase in awareness over time. People on the other side of the digital divide may become aware of AI more slowly. People that use it may become more aware of it. And that's one of the metrics we measure with science and technology, is are people aware of it or not. And another thing that we can perhaps expect is that perceptions will be shaped by the impact of AI on daily life. So if people engage with AI and it's useful to them, they might have more positive perceptions. If people, for example, lose their jobs due to AI or in some other way are disadvantaged by it, you might see more critical, negative perceptions of it. But we will see as time unfolds what really the nature of those changes are. But the critical thing of all the changes, both to think about and to measure, is that there is a huge amount of demographic variance in perceptions, in how, whether people have positive or negative attitudes, their level of knowledge, where they get the information from, what their behaviors are, varies significantly across different groups, whether it's urban or rural groups, whether it's young and old, I think is perhaps the biggest disjuncture. Different generations use technology and AI very differently. Those of us who have children will be acutely aware of this. And demographics also define the winners and losers. So if you are low income, living in a rural area with a low level of education and no access to internet, you're going to have a fundamentally different experience to those that are urban and middle class. But all that being said, to me the main aspect to bear in mind is that we need to expect the unexpected. So the show isn't over with AI. We can't fully foresee which direction it'll take. It may be the case that the power that is vested in LLMs increases over time, and therefore the social impact and the impact of perceptions increases over time. It may also be the case that AI has plateaued because the R&D labs are throwing more and more computing power at it, and the LLMs just keep hallucinating, and it seems like a dead end. So the social change may actually hit its peak and then begin to be integrated. There's also a possibility that an AI bubble occurs and the market implodes and AI kind of tapers off as a force for change. We don't know yet. If we did, we'd invest accordingly. But what we do know is that we will measure, we will conduct surveys, and we'll find out, and that in turn will inform our decisions.
And I think that's going to be a very interesting study to see how the public perceives both the benefit and the challenges of AI in a data-driven AI world. You've mentioned a lot of intersectional identities, and we have our intersectionality expert right here, and I'd like to come back to you, Lorenzo. How can we design engagement strategies in a way that acknowledges and responds and respects these various intersectional identities? And you know that in the context of South Africa, these are multi-layered and varied.
Yeah. So when we talk about gender and an intersectional lens, we essentially say that women and girls and all other groups actually don't arrive at science and thrive at science in the same way. It is shaped by different factors, like my colleagues already mentioned, about where you live, your household income level, rural, urban locations, etc. And then also race in South Africa. We see that in the survey as well. So intersectionality helps us to see those layers and how they impact each other. And we see that for experiences for especially Black women and colored women, where most of those categories intersect, it really disadvantages them to benefit, to access science, but then also to thrive in science. So it's important for us when we do outreach to keep those things in mind and to design for that, right? So the SAPRS survey gives us some important clues, right? So most South Africans believe that women can succeed in science, but then confidence drops among older adults, people with lower levels of education, poorer households, and people from rural communities. And the issue then is not about trust in science, but it really, because trust levels remains high. But it's really about reach, it's about relevance, and it's also about representation. So we need to design with that in mind. And what can this look like, right? So it can look like using local languages. Sahir mentioned some of this earlier. It's about working with local radio stations, with partnering with our churches, libraries, even women's groups. And it's also about creating low data or offline activities for people who have challenges with internet access and accessibility. And then partnering with NGOs and local creators of content so that the content is created where people are and not far away from them in the cities where you kind of imagine what this content will translate to in that specific context. Like something that can work here in Khayelitsha and Langa and Cape Town doesn't necessarily work in Kuruman or wherever in the rural Eastern Cape, right? So it's also about showcasing role models that feel relatable to young girls. They need to see themselves reflected in how we portray science. And yeah, and it's like I mentioned earlier about me supporting my kids and igniting that spark very early on. Not all of the parents or caregivers can give that. So we also need to look at support, supporting caregivers, which are sometimes grandmoms and aunties looking after young children. So we need to help them with tools to, help support that interest, to spark conversations at home. So yeah, really, the SAPRS survey points to a design principle where an intersectional engagement isn't about doing more, but it's about doing differently and thinking differently about who we want to reach, who are currently being left behind.
I actually want to take what you've said about reach and accessibility and layer that with what Michael has said about, digital technologies and AI and this intersectional approach. Because as we move into a more digital reality, what does that mean for places like museums? So I'd like to ask you, Shanae, as we move towards a more digital platform, where do museums fit in, and how can we ensure that we are considering these kind of things in accessibility and that it does not exacerbate or continue to divide?
It's a great question, and it's a difficult question because there's a lot to consider. As museums move to that digital world, they are offering an expansion beyond physical walls. We are attempting to use digital tools to break that socio-economic and geographic barriers. And these barriers are unfortunately very prevalent within all communities globally, not just locally. We also want to use those digital tools to reshape education. We need to make education accessible, as in a learner that has a device, a school has a projector, and a community can have a shared connection. It allows them to explore and to further expand on their own knowledge. It allows them to resonate with the museum and also feel part of that museum. I think in saying that, we see the negative side of this as well, unfortunately, because it's a complexity in accessibility. We have problems like connectivity, cost, we have language barriers, digital literacy still very lacking all over South Africa. And it is something that's difficult to communicate to those that don't know that these are the missing components. We also see the importance of growth in the digital world as something that's perhaps quick in one pace and then very stagnant in the other. And this is also where it plays to the socioeconomic barrier. So we need to see the digital solution to be relevant, and it needs to have cultural importance and impact. It needs to resonate, and needs to reinforce the learning that not only children, but I want to include adults in this as well, that they need to be able to access. There's projects going on no one even knew about. I'd like to speak just quickly about the repatriation from Scotland. No one knew about it unless you were in that bubble, that community, you wouldn't have known. And that's an important part of history we just gained back as South Africa. It's very important to make that accessible on the broader spectrum. And this is the wonderful thing about digitizing exhibits. So we speak into growing our digital footprint, and I want to speak as Iziko as well. We see Iziko being a forefront of that. The planetarium and digital dome has done an amazing digitized project. It was the first in Africa to do so, where it takes art and science and it blends it so seamlessly that you get this immersive experience that just resonates with a young audience especially. And when you talk to the older audience, they love it. They love to learn about things they never knew they didn't know. They love the stars. And you'll see the passion, that thread of passion that we pull and we ignite, and that's by using the digital format. We also have the Tata Mdiba exhibit. It is currently also online, and that also allows those that have never been to Robben Island or walked that path of history to be included as well. So we do see the negative drawback, but I do think it is positive impact. We have 200 years of legacy here, and the way we remain relevant and resilient is we include the digital footprint with accessibility. But physical accessibility is still very important, and we need to acknowledge that outreach plays a huge role in that. So we have us going out, teachers, educators, we have engagement officers taking part of the museum to communities that don't have the digital access nor the physical means to come here. But we don't want to just stop there. We have the public is allowed to come for free on special days like public holidays. They come for free and they get to experience this. We house over 1.5 million artifacts and specimens. It's joyous to see that everyone can partake in experiencing the data of Earth and that history and that past. You are now becoming part of the science story, the solution. And that is just, it's an incredible time to be alive where technology meets the physical boundaries of a place. It's lovely, and it's awe-inspiring that we keep bringing that energy to the classroom, to the outreach, that we keep focusing on bringing digital and that physical aspect.
And I think that's the perfect segue into the conversation around bridging gaps, right? You have a lot of historical artifacts in the museum, I've seen it, and you are increasing accessibility with technology, which is often seen as a future forward-looking part of society, and the way that you express bridging the gaps generationally, you know, between young and old, and that is fascinating to me, and I have to commend the museum for really taking an innovative approach to thinking about outreach and thinking about engagement in a way that resonates with different kinds of people and different members of society. But there's nothing like the physical engagement, right, Dr. Parker?
Certainly.
And I'd like to maybe speak to you a little bit about the physical engagement of science communication and the relevance of making science not only visible, but valuable.
Thank you, Nicole. I think that's a fascinating question, and something that's answered particularly well in the results of the South African Public Relationship with Science survey. The data reveals that South Africans have a very unique relationship with science. Some people have had the opportunities of access to science engagement opportunities, the tremendous impact that education, home support, has had on individuals' lives and the ability to engage with science. There are communities in this country that don't have those opportunities, that often find it difficult to engage more meaningfully. As a result of that, we find that the socioeconomic disparities can mediate people's ability to access science engagement opportunities. In a country where education has been affected by years and years of political factors that have kept people from meaningfully engaging with science, we find that issues of lifelong learning, issues of keeping the public engaged with science, technology and innovation activities is the best medium to close some of those gaps. This is especially useful around issues of economic activity, issues of employment, and issues of meaningfully contributing to development within society. If we are to address some of these challenges in South Africa, the data that the SAPRS survey represents helps us develop something of a yardstick. How far have we come since 1994? How far do we still have to go? Institutions like museums, science clubs, science centers allows us to make science more meaningfully valuable and visible in the daily lives of ordinary South Africans. They can come to the museum, look at a fossil, touch a whale bone, see the size of a giraffe, understand the uniqueness of our animal environment. Just on the slopes of Table Mountain behind us used to be an animal called the quagga. which existed nowhere else in the world. Currently, there are some plants on this very mountain that exist nowhere else in the planet except in Cape Town, South Africa. And so when we talk about science, we talk not only about the physical and natural sciences, but also about the social and human sciences. The value of history to our lives and how that shapes who we are will influence significantly where we go into the future. And so enabling people to reach out, to touch science, to understand their past and their history, and to understand what they did not know is a vitally important part of institutions like this that creates engagement opportunities. Shanae mentioned earlier the increasing role of digitization and how that's going to affect communities going forward. The ability to separate the engagement opportunity from the physical space becomes vitally important to closing that gap. Challenges remain. Issues of data accessibility, devices, being able to link underserved rural communities with these technologies, it remains a significant challenge in South Africa. But through the use of data that comes out of surveys like the SAPRS and some other points that Michael mentioned earlier, we are able to more meaningfully influence policy, more meaningfully influence the developmental agenda, and try and make these tools more accessible to the general public so that we can close these gaps in engagement and effectively broaden the meaningful relationship with science across South African publics.
And it's about inspiring curiosity, right? That's the objective. So I'm hoping from the conversation thus far, our viewers and ourselves are realizing that science is not this abstract thing. It's part of our daily lives. It's in our mobile phones. It is part of our history. It's something that is important, and it's something that you have the opportunity to engage with in various ways, like at the museum. And surveys like the South African Public Relationship of Science is important because it helps us understand that relationship and what we can do to strengthen and enhance it. So we've kind of taken the approach where we've spoken about the lived experience of women in science. We've spoken about institutions that support science engagement like the museum. And we've even spoken about some of the survey results. And I'd like to come back to you, Michael, with your experience and expertise on science, technology, and innovation policy to maybe think about the system and how the system or policy or strategies within the public domain can maybe address some of these issues with accessibility.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, we do need to think at the policy level, at the strategic level, how do we make science more accessible? And there's a number of levels to this. I think, to me, my number one issue that I'd point out on this is the issue of language. English is not the primary language of most of South Africa, but it's the primary language of science. It's an issue my colleagues and I have been delving into for a while. It's language as both an enabler and a constraint to science engagement. And it's something that's taken seriously at a policy level, but it has a long way to go in terms of expanding access to science to South Africa's population that doesn't speak English. There are a number of challenges. The first being that in order to engage science and society outside of the English language, you firstly need resources. You need the capabilities to do that. You need the language capabilities, the translation capabilities, and you also need the lexicons, because many of South Africa's indigenous language don't have a scientific lexicon. So all those challenges are there, but the importance of it is great, because without addressing those challenges, science will not meet most of South Africa's public. It is an area where AI could help, because that could create more powerful tools for literal translation of science and also figuratively making science accessible in those languages. So that's a space to watch for progress. Another big issue, I think, systemically in terms of enablers and constraints is something we've mentioned, the digital divide. And here, the key issues really in South Africa, from my point of view, are data cost and data coverage. The South African data landscape is, one could say, oligopolistic in terms of its pricing. Poor people pay significantly more for data than rich people. The coverage is much greater in middle-class suburbs than in rural areas. Those issues need to be addressed, the underlying issues, if science engagement is going to become broader and more effective. Related to the survey, I would say public perceptions play an enormous role in either enabling science engagement or constraining it. And perceptions can usually go at least two different ways. For example, if our indicators of trust in science are high, if there's a certain demographic that's very trusting of science institutions, believes the information it receives, is willing to engage on that basis, then you've got better engagement. Where trust is low, as measured by the survey, you're going to have a much harder time. So that's one aspect that needs to be tracked and measured and inform actions of institutions and of policymakers. There's other indicators in the survey, interest in science, right? Sources of information about science that can tell us, are people able to access or are they held back? A big one that Lorenzo has mentioned is also domestic culture. It's very difficult to steer with policy. That's a cultural thing, largely outside of control, but it does make an enormous difference whether parents take their children to museums or not, whether they provide affordances, whether it's books or internet access to science. And another important one, and it's another issue we've delved into in terms of research, is the communication skills and capabilities of institutions. So we sit here in the Iziko Museum, a flagship museum of the country with a deep history, a lovely engagement officer. Not all science institutions have those things. And their capabilities in terms of bringing in the public and translating science in a way that's meaningful are highly variable. So what we really want to do is support these skills and capabilities across the system. Then finally, and most broadly, in terms of policy support for science engagement. In that sense, South Africa is doing very well. The Department of Science, Technology and Innovation does have a science engagement program. It has a science engagement strategy. There's policy instruments that are in play. It's supportive of museums, of science centers, of all kinds of mechanisms to bridge that divide, including the National Research Foundation, which requires science engagement, including the South African Agency for Science and Technology Advancement, which promotes science engagement, including universities, including museums. But this kind of policy support requires resources. So that's a debate about how much resources do you put into this relative to the effectiveness elsewhere. So all of those things are in play, and I think they're all in flux. And for that reason, I think the measurement is particularly critical.
I agree with you, and I think you touched on something that speaks to a culture shift, right? Even though the household is outside the domain of policy, there can be visibility, and there can be the promotion of campaigns around engaging with your children at home, inspiring a culture of science and science engagement in your home, and that speaks to a diversity of groups. And I'd like to come back to you, Shanae, because I know that in your role as an engagement officer, you obviously meet so many different groups of people, different groups of youth, schools, etc. And maybe you could provide a reflection on what insights you have gained from interacting with those diversity or that diverse group.
Thank you. I think the most important aspect that we can take away from this, especially even this whole discussion, is human connection is the most important part about what we do as outreach, as engagement. Human connection trumps content. So we diverge with a large group of the first-time learner to the lifelong learner. So we need to make sure that we're not just sharing knowledge, but we're building a relationship, making meaningful connections between science and how they feel and relate and inspired by the science that they see out there. we don't want to just lecture, we want to build an open dialogue between the new learners especially and the lifelong learners, between our own science engagement. I think it's also important that we build trust, and not just trust between the engagement officer and the public. I think it's to build trust in science in whole. And I feel engagement officers especially, and in overall outreach programs, is meant to do that. It's supposed to facilitate keeping a building block of trust. We also need to approach science in a sense that it's not one-fit-all solution. It's very important to speak to using different formats, using correct language, multiple formats that other people can relate to. Science isn't for that person that relates only. Science is meant to be for the, oh, it's not for me person. You're not allowed, or you don't have to be interested in science, but we don't want you to feel that way. It's not a scary topic, it's not something to shy away from. The whole point of science is to build curiosity and innovation. So we want to keep that relationship alive. I think outreach especially is meant to ignite that passion from outside sources. You want to either open a field to new science, or you want to open a field to a lifelong learner. I also want to speak just a bit about when we do outreach, it's also important to realize and to make other people realize the STEM system of going physics and maths, and it's not the only way to get into the science portfolio. We have such a lovely citizen science program in astronomy as well. We have other organizations that teach you how to be a scientist, and programmers, and all of those other things lead into the scientific field. We don't have to be boxed into just one category within the schooling system. So it's imperative that we just teach that in the outreach. I think it's important. I also just want to empower people to keep that curiosity alive and to ask the right questions that they feel comfortable. And again, if you don't like the science, that's fine, but I want you to walk away from each engagement, each outreach program, saying, I learned something new. And that it is relatable to what you just learned. Your daily life is science. That relatability needs to be in every single program, and in every single person needs to realize we're not trying to scare you away or to pull you against your force. We want you to come and realize it's around you. Your interactions is always going to be part of science. It's just how far you're willing to go as a learner. And I think that's important, that we just realize we are all lifelong learners. Just on our panel alone, we are lifelong learners.
And I think you've touched on something really important, something that Lorenza has reflected on in her experience about selecting science at school and being fearful of the physical sciences because people were failing. But not being exposed to the different options that you have really has limitations on what you understand science to be and the different kind of fields that could be possibilities for your career. So it's very important that our students are exposed to all the different fields of science, engage with it, communicate with it, touch it, feel it, and understand that it's not just about science in a lab, that there's science in the sky, and there's all these different avenues that they can learn, and make a really informed decision of, this is not for me, not because I'm fearful of it, because I'm not interested in it, and I think that's extremely important. Lorenza, I'm touching on you, so I actually want to come back to you. You did mention something about women in science and just thinking about the future of science engagement. What do you think is the most important thing for women not to only access science, but to thrive in science?
Thanks, Nicole. So on that point, I want to draw on the work of Gendered Innovations. And they've really categorized 3 areas for creating sustainable change in the science ecosystem. And that involves fixing the numbers, fixing the institutions, and fixing the science. And in our conversation, it's fixing the science communication, right? So on fixing the numbers, it really is about addressing the underrepresentation of women and girls in STEM, but also into leadership positions, right? So when we see boys and girls have equal access to schools and university even, the numbers are more or less equal. But around the doctoral level, you really see a drop in the representation of women, and that they never really catch up with men into higher leadership positions. So around fixing the numbers, it's about creating access, it's about creating more opportunities, and then the support to really strengthen the pipeline for girls from very early engagement through primary and high school into university and then further on into their careers. When we talk about fixing the institutions, it's about eliminating some of those systemic obstacles, right? It's about creating supportive spaces where women can really thrive and do science and do their work without having the limitations around them, where it's really work environments that allow them to balance the different roles that they play in life. And when we talk about fixing the science, we talk about gender and inclusivity, intersectionality in the science itself. How do you design your studies? How do you conduct your studies? Who participates? Whose studies get funded? Who benefits from the science, right? And then also coming to today's conversation around who benefits from and how do we share our science to create that inclusivity, so that essentially it's not just about creating opportunities and getting girls to access into institutions for women to have opportunities at a table, but to really create spaces where they can thrive.
I love that so much, how you put into perspective. It's because we're talking about science and science engagement, almost as this physical artifacts that we can visit and we can engage with. But there's also scientists, these women scientists and men scientists that are creating research and creating these amazing artifacts. And are we as scientists thinking about how inclusive and how intersectional our own approaches are? And I love that you made that point. On the topic of science and research, Saeed, I'd love to ask you, thinking in the future, the next round of the survey, which is anticipated to take place in 2027, what does success look like in the next round of the survey? What gaps are you hoping to address, and maybe what success factors do you think or you hope to see?
Thank you, Nicole. If any of us had those answers, they'd be worth their weight in gold. But I think if I were to take a guess, it was to understand that if 25 years in the NSI has taught me anything, it's very rarely having all the answers, but having the curiosity to ask the right questions, which makes any endeavor successful. I think as we look forward to the next survey, we must recognize that a healthy public relationship with science does not demand everyone has an extreme interest in science, that everyone pursues a PhD. It does not demand that everyone is as interested as I am or as my colleagues are in science and scientific activities. But it does require everyone has a basic understanding, a level of interest that relates to what they do in their daily life. As the world becomes more digital, we are forced to engage with technology more and more every day. And so as a culture, we need to evolve and shift. As I mentioned earlier, South Africa comes from this education, science culture tradition where it was not for everyone. Lorenzo alluded to the intersectionality and this emerging notion that we have to broaden the scope of who can be a scientist. And we have to do that beyond Hollywood. I'm pretty sure we can evolve the image of a scientist beyond an old white man. It doesn't have to exist only in Wakanda. We can do this in reality as well. And so as we think of the next survey, I think it becomes important for us to understand, how do we close these gaps in science engagement? How do we make science more accessible? Shana spoke earlier about the importance of citizen engagement and citizen science. How do we involve people in areas of astronomy, in areas of anthropology. South Africa leads the way under the auspices of the Meerkat and the SKA project in the Northern Cape. We are tracking the third interstellar object to ever come into our solar system at present time. Through the work of the University of Johannesburg, we've broken barriers in the areas of anthropology, not just through the physical science of anthropology, but in the promotion of women anthropologists involved in the field. And so creating these role models, making the visuals of a scientist more accessible to people closes those gaps. To meaningfully address the issues of science engagement will require broader structural interventions. Michael spoke about those earlier. But I think the culture of science in South Africa is one that looks at it with a bit of pride, with a lot of promise. Mike Bruton in his book alerts us to many of these scientific inventions that are South African, and many of us don't know this. And so when we begin to encounter the rich history and tradition that we've inherited at the southern tip of Africa, we begin to understand that science is in our history, it's in our DNA. And the more attention we pay to it, the more light we shine upon it, the more young people will take on the challenges of tomorrow that we've not even considered yet. And so we begin to close those gaps by shifting the culture of science. The 2027 SAPRS data would serve us well to see some of those engagement metrics close those gaps. We have a population that shows this unique relationship with science, but to shift that uniqueness in a positive direction, enabling communities to close those gaps, enabling broader opportunities for engagement, a broader realization of what this means to me in my daily life, in weather patterns, in the ability to see the value of science in economic opportunities, becomes critical to closing some of those gaps. And so as a society, I think we look forward as a research team to producing a set of results that speaks to the meaningful realities of South Africans as they engage with science into 2027, but to also remember that it's a long-term survey, that it's about data trends over time, and the 2022 results represents the baseline of a study. 2027 will be the first opportunity we've had for a trend comparison. And then as we look forward to 2032 and 2037, these results will begin to take on a different meaning within the South African science communication landscape. And we certainly look forward to that.
Thank you so much for that, Sayed. And I'd like to come back to you now, Michael. A concluding comment, maybe, if you could speak to how surveys like the South African public relationship with science, how they could speak to policy and governance issues.
Thanks, Nicole. That's a really good question, because surveys are indispensable to the creation of policy and to the creation of good governance in many, many ways. And I would invert the question and say, without surveys, without quantitative data about the context, policymakers would effectively be driving blind with no dashboard. You can't see what's out there, you can't see how fast you're going, you can't see how the system's working. So surveys are critical, and the South African public relationship with science is one of those critical surveys. There are many others relevant to science and technology. There's a research and development survey at the national level, an innovation survey at the national level, a labor force survey at the national level. This one is about public perceptions of science. And again, to continue to invert the question, without any information about public perceptions, how do you create policy? Firstly, policy must address the fears and aspirations of the public. Unless you do a survey, you don't really know what those are. The South African Public Relationship with Science survey asks, what are your reservations? What are your concerns? What are your fears? What are the areas where you see opportunity? And policy must respond to those public concerns and areas where they feel there's potential. Again, and more broadly, science policy needs to meet the public where they are. And unless you measure where they are in terms of what they know and how they feel and where they get their info, you cannot meet them there. There's also, really critically for science engagement, the need to inform and communicate with and find and locate. And different groups have such radically different sources of information and ways of being reached that without that survey information, you'll get it wrong. There's some demographics that are best reached through radio. There are some demographics that are best reached online. There's some demographics that can only be reached in person. And without measuring it, you don't know, really, what form of action to take. There's also the question of providing relevant knowledge. So the survey tests some basic knowledge items. There's other data that can be triangulated. But when you reach out to the public with knowledge, you want it to meet them. So you don't want it to overshoot them. You don't want it to fall short of where they are. You want to meet them at the correct place, and that requires data. Then more broadly, science engagement at some level seeks to influence attitudes, right? We want a more positive attitude towards science. We want attitudes where people are open to learning, open to engaging with scientific concepts, whether it's astronomy or biotech or archaeology or whatever it is. And we can't craft those messages optimally unless we know what the existing attitudes are. And that's why we need to measure them. And I think overall the most important thing, as we've discussed, is demographically different groups of the country are in very different places in all of these metrics. So if you want to craft a customized science engagement strategy, whether it's for the country or the museum or a classroom or your own child, you have to know where you're sitting on all of these issues in order to be effective with your policy.
Thank you so much. We have come to the end of our Connect. I would like to thank each and every one of our panelists for joining today. You have really helped us weave together the conversation of policy and the importance of the survey and data and science communication and engagement. So I'd like to thank you. So you have come on a journey with us. We have traveled from astronomy to learning about the Kwacha and how important science is, the role science plays in society, and how important it is to engage with science. I hope that we have helped you bridge the gap between data and dialogue, science and society, but also helping you connect to social science that makes a difference. I hope you realize how important your voice is and how much it matters in affecting policy and participating in surveys like the one we spoke about today, like the South African Public Relationship with Science Survey. I'm Dr. Nicole van Reede, and thank you for joining us today. This is HSRC Connect.